Today we're going to continue with time period 7, and we were looking at imperialism in chapter 20. Here in chapter 21, we're going to get a little bit more into how international policy impacts the workings of the United States and different events and different groups that become impacted by the outcome of World War I and the prior imperialism in the 1890s. So let's go ahead and get started. So here we are. Notice our dates, 1919 to 1932. So this will take us from the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and the issues over the League of Nations up through the Great Depression and the beginnings of the Great Depression here after the stock market crash in 1929 and the collapse of the economy here in the early 1930s. So after World War I, there's going to be this shift back towards a more conservative approach to economics, more conservatism towards social reform, like we had seen in the progressive era. So if we think about the different chunks of time again, we've talked about Reconstruction, we've talked about the Gilded Age, then we talked about populism and progressive movement, then we get into the age of imperialism. And then at the end of World War I, we're going to see things kind of swing back to where there's more of an effort to get government out of operating businesses, to get government out of regulating social reform like the progressive reforms. And a lot of that has to do with the end of World War I. So we kind of swing things back from a liberal approach to a more conservative approach here in this time period. One place that we see this in particular is with labor unions. So notice the image here on the left. This is a propaganda poster from World War I. And you've got the arm of labor, and notice that his sleeve is blue. And then you've got management in the company, which the sleeve is white. So that gets, you may have heard the terms blue collar versus white collar workers. Blue collar workers are those who are labor, okay? And then white collar workers would be like the bookkeepers or the management in the offices of these factories. So look what it's saying, that they're going to roll up their sleeves. They're going to do it together to keep those military forces fighting. So it was very unpatriotic to go on strike or to fight against the businesses if you're a labor union during the war, okay? So the War Labor Board was part of that, and it prevented any sort of strikes. And if there was a dispute, this War Labor Board worked it out so that there was continuing to be production during World War I. And then you can see that some of the areas that had typically been the source of the conflict, the pay and the work hours, all of that was kind of being worked out during the war by the War Labor Board. So labor and business are working together pretty cohesively during World War I. After the war is over, that falls apart, and we're going to see enormous numbers of people going on strike after World War I will end. They are soldiers coming back, they're not going to be able to find jobs, there's competition for work, wages are going to go down because there aren't as many government contracts for production. And so notice that there were 3,000 strikes in a single year involving over 4 million workers. And that was dangerous. Now, also, I want you to think back. One of the events that occurred during World War I was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the rise of Vladimir Lenin and the Communist Party. So one of his predictions that he makes, and one of the claims that he makes as he is now the leader of the Soviet Union, is that the workers of the world are going to rise up against capitalism, and that there's no way that labor is going to work for the benefit of someone else. And so he believes that there's going to be this mass worldwide uprising against capitalism. So when you see 4 million workers going on strike on the heels of these statements coming out of Vladimir Lenin and the Soviet Union, some people begin to associate these strikers as buying into this communist ideology that's going to tear down the capitalist system. And so there becomes this fear of radical infiltration in the United States. Notice this cartoon. So it's saying that The United States is closed on account of the strikes. And just when I had such an advantage in the start of the race for the world markets, because again, coming out of World War I, which country is the most intact? Which country's economy is the strongest after World War I? That's the United States. So you would think that this would be the time that the United States could seize upon that advantage in the global markets, but instead production is crippled because of all of those strikes. And they start to view that as part of the radical issues here. So participation in labor unions starts to decline as that association begins to take place. And we call this the Red Scare. And it's going to permeate through labor unions and workers' movements, as well as it will in general society as well. So by the Red Scare, we're talking about the fear of communism infiltrating the United States. And that comes from the communist flags being primarily red. And so anytime you hear someone being referred to as a red at this time, that was an accusation that they were leaning towards communism. All right, so in this Red Scare, look at some of this propaganda that comes out. We've got a book in particular that is going to try to indicate the differences in how you identify someone who is living near you or working with you who may be leaning towards communism. And that was in this book, Americanism versus Bolshevism, which would be tied to communism. So look what it says. We'll never change the blue and white to red. And so it's again talking about how communism is part of this anarchy, and that will never come to the United States. And then swat the fly, but use common sense. So there's going to be new laws that come out to restrict any sort of subversive activity that was going on in the United States. But look at Uncle Sam. So if we've got this sedition legislation and he's got this hammer to swat a fly, you've got to also think back to what we talked about with John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Act and the Federalist early on, that there was a fine line between protecting the interest of the United States from some sort of treasonous seditious behavior and violating the rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution. So they're kind of issuing a warning here, right? This would be the purpose behind this particular image. So organizations begin to form across the United States. American Legion, which does still exist today. Some of you may be familiar with American Legion and the baseball, right? American Legion baseball was something that they were trying to foster these very patriotic activities for young people. If you can come and play baseball at the American Legion, then you're not out getting in trouble and getting into communist activity. And then notice this magazine cover for the American Legion here in the 1950s. So this Red Scare will come after World War I, dies down a little bit, but then it kicks back up again after World War II in the 1950s. And look what it says. Why colleges, or do colleges have to hire red professors? Here's that word red, representing communism. Parents can rid campuses of communists who cloak themselves in academic freedom. So this idea of what was being taught in these colleges and universities, a lot, and even in high schools, a lot of parents and a lot of people were fearful that they were trying to brainwash children, that this was the best way to infiltrate the United States. And it got to the point where legislation was passed. I've already mentioned that, this sedition legislation. We talked about the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act back when we were studying World War I in Chapter 20. But then there's also going to be more efforts to try to make sure that people working in the government or in schools were loyal to the United States, and loyalty oaths became required for conditions for many jobs. And that didn't go away. I'll show you in just a minute what I'm talking about. So this fear of infiltration of businesses in the government spills over into the Attorney General's office. A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General for the United States. And there was a bomb that was planted outside of his home and or his office. And he wasn't injured, but it was certainly an incident that caused a lot of panic. And so there began to be raids, and we call those the Palmer raids of the 1920s, where A. Mitchell Palmer and the government goes into trying to arrest people who they believe are leaning towards communism. Out of this, we also see the creation of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And J. Edgar Hoover is going to be the initial director of the FBI, and he will be there for quite some time. So look at this poster here, warning from the FBI. The war against spies and saboteurs demands the aid of every American. When you see evidence of sabotage, notify the FBI at once. When you suspect the presence of enemy agents, tell it to the FBI. So they were convinced that there were spies everywhere in the United States. Beware of those who spread enemy propaganda. Don't repeat the vicious rumors and vicious whispers. Tell it to the FBI, and they'll go and investigate through these incidents like the Palmer raids. But the question became, when they came in and raided these offices and businesses and agencies, did they have probable cause to suspect that people were truly spies? You know, what evidence did they have? And does this violate, again, individual rights? Has it gone too far? All right, so I put this in here. This was back a few years ago. I was teaching some classes at Georgia State University, and as one of the forms that I had to fill out for my position at Georgia State, look what it says. So this was, and I took a picture of it because I was teaching at the same time at Lassiter High School, and I was kind of interested here that I had to also swear my loyalty as a condition of employment in the university. So Georgia law requires all employees of state government to take an oath that they will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Georgia. And so there I had to swear my loyalty that I was not going to do anything under penalty of law for, you know, being disloyal. But then there was another page that went a step further. So look at this one. So the Sedition and Subversive Activities Act of 1953. So these loyalty oaths that you sign in Georgia, and I'm assuming that they're still in effect. This one was from a little bit earlier that I had to sign. But even then, look how specific it gets. It requires each applicant employee to complete and sign prior to employment in state government a certification that there are no reasonable grounds to believe that he or she is a subversive person. A subversive person is defined as one who commits, advocates, or teaches any act intended to overthrow or destroy the government of the United States or the government of the state of Georgia by force or violence, or who is a knowing member of a subversive organization. So these were and still are conditions of employment. I'm assuming that they're still in place. So this was not too many years ago that I had to sign these. All right, there was an example of how this assumption of corruption and subversion was bleeding into the immigrant communities of urban areas. And the case of Sacco and Vanzetti is a great example of that. So again, if you're ever looking for examples to answer an SAQ or an essay question, examples of the Red Scare, okay? The Sacco and Vanzetti case is a good example of that. So there was a murder that had taken place in Boston, and the two people who were charged with the crime were Sacco and Vanzetti. They were immigrants to the area in Boston, and they were known to be anarchists. So without a whole lot of evidence to actually link these two individuals to the murder, they were picked up by police because, of course, if you're an anarchist, then you've probably committed this murder. They stay in jail for 5 or 6 years, and then eventually they are executed in 1927. So notice this cartoon. You've got the execution here, and you've got labor in Boston, 1927, and you have witches in Salem in 1692. So that's kind of making reference back to the Salem witch trials, which Salem is right outside of Boston. And you have all of these people who were protesting this. Sacco and Vanzetti, they've not been given any justice, and that they were innocent men. Now, historians still are not 100% certain whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty of the crime. There was circumstantial evidence that maybe they were involved, but it's not it is not 100% accepted by everybody whether or not they were truly involved. So were they sentenced to death simply because of their association with a radical movement? It's possible, okay? Red Summer is where we also see race riots beginning to break out. And these infiltration, we talked about the Great Migration, where there were large numbers of African Americans moving to urban areas in the North during World War I. We began to see that when the war was over and white soldiers begin to come back, they want their jobs back, there's competition for work, and race riots begin to break out across the United States. And we call that Red Summer. That was in 1919. Again, and it's the kind of bringing together those strikes that are coming on the heels of World War I, the Great Migration, and then also the urban growth of African Americans in these areas. So some of the worst riots were in Chicago during Red Summer, and it was an implication of this idea of racial conflict not being isolated to the South. So Red Summer is a clear indication that there are racial problems throughout the United States that are unaddressed. So going back to the idea of labor unions and what businesses are going to be doing, they begin to try to circumvent the labor unions and begin to gain the loyalty of their workers through something called the American Plan, where they begin to offer almost like incentives to work in certain factories or in certain companies. And in return, there was a pledge not to go on strike. So we have the decline of the labor union membership. Look at the difference here. In 1920, there were over 5 million members. Less than a decade later, it was almost cut in half. And that's largely due to the association of radical activity with those strikes that come about. So then here we've got the American Plan. Again, it's offering some of those incentives. We'll look at some of those in just a second. And then there's another term that I want you to be familiar with, and I'm not sure that it's in your book, but it's the term yellow dog contract. And a yellow dog contract was where a worker signs a contract to work in a company, and in return, they promise never to join a union. And so it was just this connection, and notice that Pullman workers signed, they were just one example of Pullman workers who signed yellow dog contracts. And it was trying to convince them. So in this advertisement, they're trying to say, don't sign these, that it limits your opportunities. But so you've got labor that's being pulled in two different directions. So then businesses start to up the incentives, like maybe they're going to provide healthcare, or maybe they're going to provide, in addition to healthcare, maybe they would provide a gym membership. Think about what companies offer today as incentives. Sometimes you might get a company car or a 401k retirement plan. Something like that is an incentive to have workers being willing to take this job over a different job. We're going to call that welfare capitalism, where you have benefits in addition to your salary. And this is, again, trying to promote worker satisfaction and to stop workers from joining unions. And Henry Ford is one of those business owners that kind of sets the standard for this. He's paying more in salary than any of his competitors, and that's to get the best workers. We're going to talk about Henry Ford and his assembly line in just a minute, but he's going to pay almost double what other factories are paying. So he's going to get the best workers. Well, are those workers going to be late to work? Are they going to slack off? Are they going to work slowly? Are they going to make mistakes? No. He's going to be able to really get the best of the best through his incentives that he pays his workers. Okay, dollar diplomacy is something that we've already mentioned, where, again, we're kind of looking at economics here, labor within the United States. But another way that we can look at economics is the influence of the United States around the world economically. TAFT is going to be doing this through encouraging businesses to open up factories in Latin America, open up banks that are going to make loans, not just to individuals in those countries, but even to governments. And then sometimes the military has to come in and make sure that those loans and those payments are being being made. So he's saying that U.S. foreign affairs and our relationship internationally is tied to our business investments. And we call that dollar diplomacy. So here we can see that Latin America is going to be the primary focus here of investment, or at least in North America will be the primary focus of American investment through dollar diplomacy. All right, your book goes into some of the situations that arise out of this, like the United Fruit Company. I think you talked about that some last year in world history. All right, so fast forward to 1920. We've just gotten out of World War I. We've got problems with labor in the United States, labor unrest. We've got riots in the streets with Red Summer, and the election is rolling around. And we know that Woodrow Wilson had the massive stroke after the he was trying to promote the League of Nations. And so the Democrats will choose from Ohio their candidate, who, again, actually both of these candidates are from Ohio. So you've got Cox versus Harding, and Cox is going to carry on the same policies that Wilson promoted. And it's basically the League of Nations that he's really working towards. And we know that some of the disagreement over the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles was the League of Nations potentially tying the United States to alliances with other countries and their affairs of other countries, and this idea of progressive reform that we know Wilson continues in the tradition of Theodore Roosevelt. So what Harding is going to campaign on as a Republican is what he calls a return to normalcy, where he wants business to thrive, and he wants less regulation of businesses, and he wants less influence of the government in social reform of the time period. And so with the conflicts that were breaking out, people tended to lean towards that. Okay. And then this idea of the League of Nations in World War I was still difficult for people to adhere to. So it was not, again, that these people of the Deep South were truly committed to joining the League of Nations. It was that they were not going to vote for the Republican, regardless of who it was. So Warren Harding wins the election of 1920 in a landslide. And his administration is going to allow big business to once again thrive. And his Secretary of the Treasury is going to be cutting taxes on companies, cut government spending, raising that tariff once again, all in favor of big business. So we're kind of swinging things back the way they were during the Gilded Age in terms of monetary policy. And production thrives, and the U.S. is exporting more than ever before around the world, and money is flowing. There's prosperity in the United States. But behind the scenes, Warren Harding surrounded himself with his poker buddies. He was not the most intelligent of presidents we've ever had, but he was definitely the life of the party. He was very personable. People liked him. But he didn't choose wisely when he chose his cabinet or the people to head his executive agencies. And we refer to all of these people who make up his cabinet as the Ohio Gang, because they were engaged in corruption. They were lining their own pockets with money that they were getting simply from their position of power. One example of that we will see come out after Warren Harding dies unexpectedly, Calvin Coolidge replaces him. So Warren Harding is president, and then suddenly he dies. And then Calvin Coolidge comes in as the new president and continues most of his economic policies, but not the corruption, right? So he cleans things up in terms of the corruption. What ends up coming out, I mean, people were devastated that this president has died. He was incredibly popular, but it was after he was already gone that the exposure of some of the worst scandals come to light. And it kind of tarnishes Harding's reputation, but it's not until after he's already gone. So the biggest scandal that gets uncovered after Warren Harding is already gone is the Teapot Dome scandal. So I would know this as an example of Harding's corruption within his administration. Now, he was not directly involved with this himself, but his own advisors were. So the Secretary of the Interior, his job is to monitor the resources within the United States. So it'd be like natural resources and the parks and the lands and all of that. That's the job of the Secretary of Interior, who in this case was Albert Fall. And there are oil reserves that are set aside for the military. So let's say we go to war and we've got to put oil and have enough oil for our steamships and battleships and all of this. These are all reserves that are set aside, not for public consumption. So these national oil reserves that are set aside for the military, Albert Fall actually leases them to private companies and gets kickbacks and gets money for that himself. And so all of the, and one of those was at Teapot Dome, Wyoming. The other one was out in California. And so these companies had bribed Albert Fall for use of these oil wells or access to them. And so Albert Fall, he ends up going to jail. I always remember this because Albert Fall takes the fall for the Teapot Dome scandal. So the whole reason it's called the Teapot Dome scandal is because of the place where the oil field was located in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. All right, so Coolidge is going to win the election here in 1924 because it's not until after he's in office that the scandal gets exposed. And so again, people are pretty satisfied, especially in the North, with these policies. And look, even in the West, where we had previously seen progressive reform, Robert La Follette really only carries his home state of Wisconsin. So these people are experiencing financial success. These farmers have been supplying the whole world really during World War I, and that prosperity was continuing, but they were on their way to being in trouble. So Coolidge wins in 24. He continues more of Andrew Mellon's financial policies. So of all of these advisors to Warren Harding, Andrew Mellon was not corrupt. So his policies just leaned more in favor of business. That was his philosophy, which favors the Republican and big business ideology. Coolidge continues that as president. All right, so moving into this massive growth of the economy and the boom times of the 1920s. You've heard of that before, the roaring 20s. Well, they're the roaring 20s because you've got new technology, you've got mass consumerism, money is flowing, people are buying all of these new gadgets and goods, and it's a change in lifestyle. And then you've got the women here. We'll talk about the flappers as well, that the role of women also changes in the 1920s. So these are all of the different things that we can associate with the 20s. You've got consumerism, we've got new types of music, new dancing. The Republican Party is in a period of resurgence. We've got political scandal as well, and then all kinds of prosperity. People are making money in the 20s, and they start to buy all kinds of new things. So look at some of the new items that you can buy: a vacuum cleaner, a refrigerator in your home, so you can, go grocery shopping once a week rather than going to the market each day and getting fresh meat. A washing machine, an easy chair that would be like a recliner. And notice how they've got these advertised, all of these new gadgets. You've got all of the new clothing styles. Housework is easier. So they're targeting women in their advertising because these are mostly household items that are going to make housework more efficient and easier. But notice what it says. You can pay $2 down and $4 a month until you pay off the price of this vacuum cleaner. $15 down and $12 a month to buy a piano. So you've got ways of buying these items without having all of the cash saved up. And this is going to be one of the ways that people live a very luxurious lifestyle, but they truly can't afford it because they get themselves into trouble by only making these payments. All right, so keep that in mind here in a minute. We're going to call these payments that they have, those are installment plans where you have a certain amount down and then you pay a certain amount over time. The automobile with Henry Ford, his mass production is going to be unprecedented. It got to the point where they could produce a car start to finish within, I don't know, something like 15, 20 minutes with this assembly line where they put all the parts together. So you've got separate manufacturing of the parts that are identical, and it's a matter of assembling them. And there you've just got one car after the other rolling off the assembly line. But they're all the same. You don't have different features on the car. The Model T Ford is exactly the same. The color, the features, it's all identical because that's how they were able to speed up production. But he was able to get the cost of the car down to where it was incredibly affordable. So here's the Model T. It doesn't go very fast, but it's going to get you where you want to go. And so again, it changes the way people live. So we've got new car related industries. You don't have to live within walking place of your job anymore. You can live in the suburbs. You can go on trips. And when you go on trips, you're going to have to fill up your car. So you've got to have gas stations. This becomes all new industries. People are going to start to stay in roadside motels. They're going to have roadside cafes where people are going to be eating. So these are all new businesses that emerge as a result of the car industry. So it revolutionizes everything. All right. So this consumer revolution, again, we've got consumerism across the country. We've got mass advertising across the country. What becomes popular in one region becomes popular in another region. And this consumer revolution, people are just buying. They are spending and spending and spending. And what have we said about when people are buying more and there's more demand for products, then you have more people who are working. And if more people are working, then they've got more money to go out and spend, and the economy is just skyrocketing. Okay. And Henry Ford is kind of the heart of that with the automobile, because he's paying so much more in his factory and he's attracting the best factory workers. So then the other factories kind of have to compete. And so they raise their wages. And so now people have more money to then go out and buy a car. So it's just kind of really enforcing this new way of operating those businesses. So look at some of this advertisements. Now we have celebrity endorsements. There's Babe Ruth saying that he drinks Red Rock Cola. So then you're going to go out and buy Red Rock Cola. And then this advertisement for Listerine in the 1920s. So part of advertising is convincing the consumer that you have to have that product. So here, you've got the handsome man and the beautiful woman. And if you want to attract the handsome man and the beautiful woman, then you better have good breath. And the only way to do that is to use Listerine. So again, they're using this as a way to lure more consumers. Okay, one of the other major exports coming out of the United States, not just cars and not just other gadgets, it's movies, and it's our American culture. Is one of our largest exports. Hollywood is making more than 90% of the movies that are being seen worldwide. And those are coming out of the United States. And so as a result of this entertainment industry, as a major export of the United States, you're exporting American clothing styles, hairstyles, music, consumer items, way of life. That's all being exported. And so we can call that international soft power. So it is the influence of the United States around the world. And it's not through an actual product, it's through a culture that's being sent around the world. And that's being done through the movies coming out of Hollywood. All right. So we've already alluded to this, that people were buying things in new forms. Installment buying, where we just saw, you put $2 down and you pay $4 a month till you've paid it off. Usually there's a little bit of interest added to that. It's like making payments. But then there was also the stock market, and people started to figure out that there was a way to make money without putting in more hours at work. And that was by investing in stocks in all of these new companies that were thriving in the United States because of all of this demand for consumer products. Well, if you don't have a lot of cash available, that's what you want by investing in the stock market, then there was actually a way that you could buy stock on credit. Okay, so we're going to call this buying on the margin. And we're going to simulate that in class. So just know that buying on the margin is basically buying stock on credit. You buy a certain value of stock with only a little bit of money down, and you're going to pay the rest of what you owe for the cost of the stock with the profits that you make when the stock price rises. All right, it's incredibly risky. Okay, and so buying on the margin is what a lot of folks were doing here in the 1920s. Okay, everybody's making money. Everybody's got a job. We've got people spending money beyond what they possibly could, but because they're spending, there's more demand for products. So the value of the stocks were going up. So the risk at the time, people were making huge huge profits off of buying stock on the margin. But if the stock price goes down instead of up, then you're in trouble. Okay, so buying on the margin is risky, but for the most part in the 1920s, people were having success with buying on the margin. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about this in class, where it's basically buying stock on credit. Okay, so with all this prosperity in the 1920s, underneath, there were some problems that people were ignoring. We've got the farmers. Prices on farm products plummet during the mid to late 1920s, and nobody was really paying attention. Labor union demands are really going unmet. And then we've also still got discrimination and segregation rampant in the United States. So these are still problems that are festering under the surface, similar to what we talked about with the Gilded Age. And it's going unaddressed here. All right, so here in this next section, we're going to be looking at how the government and society are at odds with one another with this massive growth of technology and consumerism at the time. So notice that I've got here, we've got jazz with Duke Ellington, and we'll talk about Louis Armstrong in just a minute with the emergence of a new style of music. We've got this woman here who is a flapper, this new age woman that comes and becomes popular in the 1920s. And then the jazz singer, which is the first movie with sound, comes out in the 1920s. So keep in mind, not every woman in the 1920s was a flapper. If anything, the flappers were the exception. They were a very small group within the population, but they drew all kinds of attention. They dressed very scandalously. They were smoking cigarettes. They were going to bars. They were cussing, and they were cutting their hair short, and they were wearing their dresses short. And it was just shocking, because that's not the way a proper Victorian age woman would act. And so because of the shock value, they were getting attention at the time. So here you've got this symbol of women's independence and the idea that women can think for themselves. They don't have to be under the control of a man all of the time. That new identity of a woman was beginning to emerge more so than ever before. And then we talked also before with the 19th Amendment being ratified by Woodrow Wilson. So that's now going into effect. And so women are exercising political independence and now social independence, that they are doing so more so than ever before. 1923, Alice Paul, who you'll remember was the founder of the National Women's Party that had gone on the hunger strikes and picketed before the White House in the lead up to the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul introduces an additional amendment to the Constitution in 1923 called the Equal Rights Amendment, and that this would not just give women the right to vote, but it would provide true equality for American citizens based on gender. So this would be the equal pay, it would be equal access to government services. All of that would be wound into the Equal Rights Amendment. So it was first introduced in 1923, and we're going to talk about ERA again, because it never gets ratified. Even to this day, this amendment has never been ratified to the Constitution, guaranteeing equality for women. And it comes up again in the 1970s. We'll talk about that later on when we get into the National Organization for Women and Gloria Steinem and some of the other women who were protesting equality for women in the workplace. But it starts here in the 20s with these women being more politically active than ever before. Another big change in the 1920s is prohibition is actually ratified. So this becomes an amendment to the Constitution that the manufacture, sale, or distribution of alcohol in the United States in any form was illegal. So it's not a law, it's an amendment to the Constitution. So why now? Why in the 1920s? Actually, it was in the early, in January of 1919 is when it goes into effect. So why then? What's the context around which this was happening? So 1919, we're coming to the end of World War I. And there is a large association with beer to Germany, German beer. Germany was the enemy in World War I. You've also got the idea that alcohol is made from grain, distilling grains. And if you are drinking alcohol that comes from grain, wheat, barley, whatever it is, then that is using that instead of creating bread or food or whatever that would go to feed troops in World War I. So it became your patriotic duty to abstain from alcohol during World War I. And that popularity and this idea of the Red Scare and that's coming out of this is going to add to people's support for the Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment. You need to link together the Volstead Act with the 18th Amendment, because the Volstead Act is how you enforce the 18th Amendment. You're making the production and sale of alcohol and consumption of alcohol illegal in the 18th Amendment. Volstead Act's how you're going to enforce it, what the rules are. So later on, we're going to see that the 18th Amendment, because alcohol is no longer illegal, but this is an amendment to the Constitution. So to get rid of this, the 21st Amendment will be ratified in the 1930s that overturns the 18th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment cancel one another out. So this is the Prohibition Amendment. And I always remember that those two cancel each other out, because when you turn 18 and when you turn 21 are both monumental years in your life. And so 18th Amendment bans alcohol, 21st Amendment brings alcohol back to being legal. While it's illegal during Prohibition, people see that they can make it illegally and make a lot of money on smuggling this illegal alcohol. So these are stills where alcohol or moonshine is being produced. And so these are enforcers. These are people, government agents, who were going out to try to find these illegal acts of producing alcohol. And these were some of the stills that they had seized. Once you produce that illegal alcohol, usually in a very remote rural area, you've got to transport it to an urban place that's going to buy it. And so these people who do the transporting of the alcohol are known as bootleggers. And here you are with your Model T, and they've retrofitted this. So they took the side off of the door, and then they fit these little shelves in, and you could fit the alcohol bottles in there. And so they would head out to try to sell that to their buyers and make money off of this. A lot of money was made in the sale of illegal alcohol. So think about what's going on here. You've got these people who are transporting this illegal product, and you've got government agents or police who are after them to try to stop them. So if you had your Model T and maybe you tinkered with the motor a little bit and made your Model T or your car go faster than those of the authorities, then you could outrun them. So this effort to make their transportation faster than the government agents or the police, that's really where we see the origins of NASCAR, the auto racing, was with bootlegging during Prohibition. So if you go to Dawsonville, Georgia, just up Georgia 400, there is the NASCAR Hall of Fame Museum is there, and they have a whole section to bootlegging because that's where it began. And Dawsonville is kind of the home of NASCAR racing, or at least part of it, because that area was known for distilling alcohol illegally during Prohibition. And some of the first and most successful bootleggers that were around came out of Dawsonville and that area of the North Georgia mountains. And so that's kind of where NASCAR began, was with bootlegging. There were also these fancy clubs that sold alcohol illegally in their clubs, and you had to have a membership to be part of this, and they were known as the speakeasies. So you would have these cards that identified you as a patron who could be trusted. There were secret code words or knocks, and you would knock on the door and you'd go in, and it was this elaborate club where alcohol was free flowing. So the people who were really doing all of the buying of this illegal alcohol and selling it in these clubs and making a fortune would have been part of the early efforts at organized crime. So by organized crime, we're talking about these gangsters that would make money off of illegal alcohol, and Al Capone was probably one of the more famous of those. Now they get into other ways of making money as well, but this is probably one of the main areas where they make a fortune. Okay, socially, there we talked about this kind of this resurgence of conservatism at the beginning of this particular chapter. And there was once again, with all of this mass consumerism and material goods and people spending money beyond their means, and women behaving in a way that they've never behaved before, again, people start to want to bring society back to its religious foundation. And we call this the fundamentalist, or the revival of fundamentalism in the United States. And it's trying to bring back these very traditional ideas of morality and society back to one that has really gone to a much more material focused society. And where we see this play out most convincingly in the 1920s is with the Scopes trial. Sometimes this is referred to as the monkey trial, because this is about the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin has published his book, Origin of the Species, which talks about natural selection and evolution, and it's challenging the creation story, the biblical creation story. And the fundamentalists want to bring that story, bring that creation story back, bring that fundamentalist religious foundation to the United States again, and try to limit the exposure of these scientific theories of evolution to the United States. And part of that, states like Tennessee, other states did as well, but the state of Tennessee made it illegal to teach about evolution in Tennessee classrooms. And so this guy, John Scopes, was a biology teacher in this little teeny tiny town of Dayton, Tennessee. It's in East Tennessee. And he was going to challenge the law in the state of Tennessee by teaching evolution. So everybody knows that he's about to do this, and he's got backing by like the American Civil Liberties Union and some of the other organizations. He has backing to defend him in court, because what they're trying to do is challenge the law and challenge the idea of, these fundamentalists versus the modernists. We're going to call them the modernist and the fundamentalist. So John Scopes, as everybody expected, teaches evolution in class one day, and he is going to be in trouble for violating this Tennessee law. So as a result, he has a trial in his town of Dayton, Tennessee, and his defense lawyer is none other than Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow at the time was the most famous trial attorney anywhere in the United States, and he's from Chicago. So this, and I used to use the example, Johnny Cochran and the Kardashians' father, I forgot his name. But anyway, the Kardashians' father, he was a trial attorney. That's where they became famous, is during the O.J. Simpson trial. That would be like having one of those caliber lawyers come and defend, this biology teacher in this little teeny tiny town in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee at the time. But that's how significant the case was, to challenge these ideas, the fundamentalist versus the modernist. So Clarence Darrow is going to defend John Scopes, who taught evolution. And then the state of Tennessee is going to have as their lawyer representing the state none other than William Jennings Bryan. So here's William Jennings Bryan. There's Clarence Darrow. If you remember, when we were studying William Jennings Bryan during the populist movement, we talked about that he was a great speaker, but we also said he was a Bible scholar. So this is why he comes in as this very famous name to defend the state of Tennessee and defend this idea of the fundamentalist ideas against the modernist evolutionary theories. So this trial has the makings of, some celebrity star-studded event in this little town. And everyone wants to watch this defense attorney go up with this incredible speaker, William Jennings Bryan. And the trial is carried on live radio across the country. Everyone's listening to it. The media descends on Dayton, Tennessee. People go, they want to watch in person, and it was ridiculous, crazy hot the summer that they had the trial. There's no air conditioning in the courthouse. So they moved the trial outside because it was just too hot and people were passing out. But look at the crowds of people there to listen. And so there is Clarence Darrow questioning William Jennings Bryan. And he asked him questions. And it's really about, again, fundamentalists versus the modernist. And so he's going to ask him questions like, do you truly believe Jonah was swallowed by a whale? Do you really believe that? And so William Jennings Bryan is talking about Bible theory, and it plays out. And so here are just some other pictures from the trial itself. But when it's all said and done, the verdict is John Scopes is guilty. He's fined, I don't know, certain amount of money, and then that's it. Was there really ever any question as to whether or not John Scopes was guilty? So why was there such mass publicity about this trial? It was about the argument about this societal friction between the fundamentalist and the modernist. It was about a clash of ideas versus one person's guilt or innocence. So that's why this trial drew so much attention. There's a great book on it, by the way. It's called Summer for the Gods. I loaned it out to someone last year and never got my book back because that was during the start of the pandemic. But anyway, it's called Summer for the Gods. If you're interested, it's a really good book that takes the story of the trial and frames it, uses that trial to frame the larger social movement in the United States. All right, people also in the heat of the Red Scare are really, really concerned about radicals coming into the United States. They're taking jobs and bringing these ideas. So there is a push on the government now that we've got more Republicans in office that are more conservative leaning. They are going to pass these immigration restrictions in the 1920s. So I would be familiar with the National Origins Act in particular, and it sets quotas. It's basically setting a percentage of people from each country that can come into the United States based on their pre-World War I numbers. Well, bottom line, very few people are going to be getting into the United States or allowed to immigrate into the United States. So these are those nativist ideas that come up once again. So let's kind of think back to the original nativist movement. We talked about the Know Nothing Party in the 1800s, right? So that nativism is now cropping in again. The Ku Klux Klan also has another spike in membership in the 1920s. There's going to be 3 different time periods where the Ku Klux Klan will see a spike in membership. The first time is when it was first originated back in the 1860s with the Reconstruction efforts. And clearly their target at that point was African Americans. Dies down a little bit during World War I because the country kind of comes together in this patriotic moment. But then it spikes up again in the 1920s, and we've got Red Summer. We know that there's race riots at that time, but also with the Klan in the 1920s, their target, in addition to African Americans, will also be immigrants. Notice what it says here: America is in danger, and so they're saying that we've got to make sure that America is protected from outside influences, and also. So they don't shift to immigrants, but it's in addition to African Americans will be their target. Then it dies down again during World War II, picks up again during the 1950s, as we will see after Brown versus Board of Education is ruled on. On the same line of race relations, Woodrow Wilson didn't have the best record on race relations. There was a movie that traces the history of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It was called Birth of a Nation. It's just a horrible movie. And Woodrow Wilson had a private screening of it in the White House. And look what he had to say. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. It's not a good situation there for Woodrow Wilson and his track record on race relations, and it largely goes back to his comments on this particular movie. All right, 1928, Herbert Hoover is going to be elected president. Once again, we have this Republican domination. What's going on in the 1920s? What's the context around which this election is taking place? Well, it's the great prosperity of the 1920s. And so with all this prosperity, you've got people who are wanting more of the same. And so that's going to be electing a Republican in office. So notice his campaign, a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. So he's talking about that there's access to all of these consumer goods. We're not fighting a foreign war at the time. And so this is something that is very popular. But notice that the Deep South, once again, is voting for the Democrat. In this case, it was Al Smith. And, you know, they're just not going to vote Republican because of this idea of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. All right. Also, culturally, in the 1920s, we're going to see the Harlem Renaissance that will begin to grow. And this was a movement to by African Americans to promote African American culture and artistic contributions to society. So we've got artwork, very iconic, very vivid, deep colors that are depicting African Americans enjoying music and their community, and it's about promoting African American art. You've probably read, I think in AP Lang, you read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And she is also, again, promoting African American culture and society through the literature. The main poet that you need to associate with the Harlem Renaissance is this man, Langston Hughes. And he is, again, promoting the influence and the success and the role of African Americans in America. So notice what he has to say here. I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. So that's referencing segregation. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. So this is honoring and encouraging African American success and the contributions to culture and society of African Americans. And so his poetry is very prominent during the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz music also becomes quite popular. It's going to kind of follow the same route that the Great Migration did, coming out of the South, coming out of New Orleans, coming out of Memphis and those areas, and then moving into these urban areas in the North. There is the Cotton Club in New York, one of the prime jazz clubs in America. And then Louis Armstrong, certainly the iconic trumpet player who was part of the jazz age, right? We call the 1920s the jazz age because this music becomes the truly unique American sound. It is blending all different types of music and musical styles together into one uniquely American style of music. Okay, and then Marcus Garvey is going to look at the situation of race relations in the United States, and he doesn't believe that it's ever going to work. And he promotes what is called Pan-Africanism. It's basically a back to Africa movement. And his organization is going to attract millions of members, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, of which he is the leader. He is from Jamaica. He's an immigrant to the United States, and he is also going to be promoting his UNIA organization. And when he sends information through the mail about the organization or about his investment, he had an investment in a steamship company that was going to be used for this Back to Africa movement. That's where he gets into trouble. And the government comes after him for, again, using the mail service for promoting ideas that were challenging the United States. So go back to this whole idea of loyalty to the United States and sedition and all of that. And so they use that as a way to stop Marcus Garvey and to stop the growth of this organization. And he gets deported. He goes back to Jamaica and becomes a very key figure and prominent figure in Jamaica as a leader there. So and then once he leaves the United States and leaves this effort, the organization pretty much collapses, as we've seen in other efforts where you remove the leader from a movement, then the movement itself tends to collapse. All right, so we're going to finish up this last part of chapter 21 with the Great Depression that is on the way. So all of the boom times of the roaring 20s will literally come crashing down in 1929. And so if we look at stock prices, they're going up and up and up and up. So if you're buying stock on the margin, like we talked about, things are probably going to work out in your favor until 1929, and it all collapses. All right, so we said that there were some kind of underlying signs of trouble economically that were going largely unaddressed. One of those was in agriculture. So look at what the prices and the dramatic drop of prices of farm products during the 1920s, where everyone else is living large, farmers are struggling. So we've got a pound of cotton that used to sell for $41 a pound. Now it's only selling for 4 cents a pound. These farmers have mortgages that they have to pay. We've talked about the debts that farmers have for their equipment or whatever it may be. And if you're not able to sell your farm product for enough money, then you don't have enough money to pay your debt. And so they were in desperate, desperate times. So these farmers actually experienced the Great Depression much earlier than everybody else does. Okay. We've got a huge gap between the rich and the poor that gets even further divided. And people are living well beyond their means. We've talked about installment plans and we talked about buying on the margin. They're buying too much on credit that they can't pay for. So as soon as they lose their job or they miss a payment, what's going to happen? They can't make those payments, and living on credit is dangerous. And then the final part of this is the stock market crash. So this is really the trigger event that causes all of these other underlying problems to be insurmountable. So there's too much money in the stock market that's being bought on the margin. So if you're buying stock on credit, there's not actually enough cash in the market to finance all these companies. All right. So as you're buying stock on the margin, it's working out. But then suddenly here, we're going to get to September the 23rd. That's when stock prices are at their peak. All right, so when we're looking at this graph, we're talking about the Dow Industrial Average. So what they do, and you'll get further into this in econ next year, but basically what they do is they take these main stocks in the United States and they track the prices of those stocks and come up with an average price for them. And so if we're looking at the Dow Industrial Average and we see where those main stocks that we're tracing over time, if their average prices are going up and down, then we can track that as kind of an overall reflection of the entire stock market. Okay. So if we're looking at the Dow Industrial Average here, and this is going in increments of July to December. And so here's July 1929 going up and up and up. Look what happens by December of 1929. And then we have a brief recovery. And then look what happens by the time we get to 1932. I mean, the prices of stocks have just plummeted. So if you bought stock on the margin, what happens to you? Well, you're in deep trouble. All right, so if stocks were at their peak last week of September 1929, by the last week of October, we start to see some trouble. The Dow Jones average fell 21 points in 1 hour. So the average prices are dropping that much in 1 hour. So this is on a Wednesday. So people are getting a little nervous. So they watch a little more closely what's happening on Thursday, October the 24th. They're watching those prices. And by the end of the day, on October the 24th, 1929, some investors start to sell their stocks. Now, you couldn't do it over computer at this time. You had to have a broker who goes to the stock exchange, makes those changes for you, right? Or use your phone and call that in if you're buying stock in other places around the country. So if this is happening, right, so look what's going on here. This is on Wall Street in New York City. You've got all of these people milling around. They're watching what the prices are in the stock market, and these cars are going by and they're like, what's going on? Oh, the stock prices are falling. So they go home and they start talking about it. And then the newspapers report on this on Friday, October the 25th. So this is what's happening in New York City. The story, people are like, oh, the stock prices are falling. It's reported across the country on Friday, October the 25th. Well, then the weekend comes around. So what happens on the weekend? What are people talking about? This is October, nice fall day, Saturday and Sunday, October the 26th and 27th, 1929. What are you talking about at the fall festival or the outdoor barbecue or the football game or whatever when you're with your neighbors and your family and your friends? You're talking about, did you see what happened in the newspaper? Did you see about what was going on with those stock prices? So you start getting a little panicky because you've probably bought on the margin. And so on Monday morning, you're going to call your stockbroker and you're going to say, I need you to sell my stock before the prices go any lower. And so when you make that call on Monday, the transaction is going to happen on Tuesday. And guess what? Millions of shares of stock are sold at the same time. And so as more and more people are selling, what happens to the price? If everybody's selling and nobody's buying, the prices go even lower. So this is the crash of the stock market in October of 1929. So these are all of these people outside the New York Stock Exchange. So it's just a mass panic, right? People see that everybody else is selling and the prices are going down, so they've got to sell too. And as more and more and more people sell, prices plummet. Okay, so here's what triggers the Great Depression. We have, of course, the crash of the stock market being the trigger of it, but what causes this is the buying on the margin, the over speculation, all of those problems that have been years in the making. We have other countries that are in trouble as well. So this tariff that we have in the United States, other countries in Europe can't sell their goods in the United States. So their markets are struggling. And if they have problems financially, are they buying American goods? No, they're not. And then we have problems in the banking system. Okay, so as everyone sees that stock market crash, they start to say, I've got to get my money out of the bank because I've got to pay all of these things that I've bought on installment plans are on the margin. And so as they go to the bank to get their money out, everybody starts to get that same idea. All right, so here's a bank in New York City. This also is in 1929. And these are all people lined up to get into the bank to withdraw their cash. Okay, now, when you go to the bank, there's not actually a box with your name on it with your cash inside. You have an account that says how much cash you have, but it's not physically in the bank. So the value of all of the bank accounts in, Wells Fargo or SunTrust or, Fidelity, whatever bank you bank at, they don't physically have that amount of cash there. So if everybody went at the same time to go get their money out of the bank, they're going to run out. So all of these people are lined up, and look at these cars going by, and they're like, oh, what's everybody doing in line at the bank? And they, they say, well, we're getting our money out of the bank. And you start thinking, oh, wow, okay. So if these people go to get their cash out and they run out of cash physically at the bank with this person right here, what happens to the person behind them and their life savings? It's gone. When a bank runs out of money, it's over. The bank is out of it. You can't be a bank with no cash. So with everybody withdrawing their cash at the same time, you're putting the entire banking system at risk. It's fear. It's a lack of confidence. So as you're driving by and all these people are trying to get their money out of the bank, you're like, phew, glad I don't bank there. Glad my bank is, somewhere else across town. And you go home that night and you start thinking about it. Wow, glad my money's safe. But, just to be sure, maybe tomorrow I need to go down to my bank and get my money out just to be safe. Well, if everybody does that, the entire banking system collapses. And that's what happened here in the Great Depression. So now you've got the stock market that crashes. You've got the banks that have collapsed and people's entire savings are now gone. And you've got no way to handle this. Companies that relied on the investments from investors and these banks that are keeping their businesses afloat, they now are in trouble. Nobody's buying any more refrigerators or vacuum cleaners. So what happens to demand at the factories that make those? Demand goes down. So when demand goes down, do you need as many workers? No. So unemployment now is out of control. So by 1933, because now instead of all this, booming economy, it's now plummeting. And we have mass unemployment. Over 25% of workers in the United States were unemployed at this point. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but I'm going to show you in comparison what we're talking about. Okay, so look at this this billboard, jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. So people started moving from town to town looking for jobs, and there weren't any. So they had to rely on soup kitchens and bread lines just to feed their families. Okay. And it becomes global. The entire world is now going to be embroiled in this Great Depression. So it was not just the United States, it was the entire world. And if you think about Western Europe coming out of World War I, they were already kind of unstable before the economy collapses. So if any country would have been able to withstand it, the United States would have been. So other countries in many respects had it worse than the United States. All right, so look at this unemployment rate. So we know that everybody, right, booming here in the 1920s, but then that's we've got everybody having a job here in the 19 teens and 1920s. But then look what happens. Here's the stock market crash. Unemployment here goes up to right around 25%. Even in the Great Recession of 2008, it never got above like 12%. So and we know that was bad. Those were bad times here with the recession in the United States, and the most recent one in 2008. It was not even close to what had occurred in 1929 with the Great Depression. So it was a dramatic shift. And even people who kept their jobs. So when we're saying 25% were unemployed, those people who were employed and had a job, what are their wages? Their wages are being cut dramatically because companies could pay a fraction of what they've previously been paying because people were just so thrilled to have a job. So even with a job, you're still financially hurting because your wages are being cut so much. So people are having to just survive by what they could get from charity, like soup kitchens, bread lines. But I want you to notice what these people in line are wearing. Look at these people. He's got on a bow tie, a vest, nice suit, nice overcoat. Their shoes look pretty clean. So what does that tell you about these people in line? Tells me they haven't been unemployed for very long. Tells me that they had a pretty stable income before. And this is something new to them. We also don't see any women in these lines. So what little money that they had, they were supporting their wives and their kids, and then they would just kind of go out in the city and get what they could to eat. All right, and then this was the last picture here. So this is actually in Chicago. This is Al Capone. He ran one of the largest soup kitchens in Chicago during the Great Depression. So this guy who was tied to organized crime and made a fortune off of bootlegging and prohibition, he's actually going to be providing assistance to people who are in trouble. And once again, these people look fairly well dressed. So it's definitely a situation that has got to have some sort of resolution. And remember who's president at the time. It's Herbert Hoover. So in the next chapter is where we get into the response to the Great Depression. And Hoover's not going to handle it very well. So until then, keep reading and go make history.